I don't know about you, but I've often heard people say the ends don't justify the means. Can't say as I ever really agreed with that. I mean, it does kind of ask, well, what does justify the means? Surely, when you save the day and everybody's happy, you've done something good, regardless how you had to get there to do it. And sometimes in great novels and plays and movies, you had to go through some pretty awful things to do it. But in the end, well, anyhow, the end. There is a whole line of ethical thinking. It's called teleological thinking, and the end is what it's all about. Aristotle's thinking really is teleological. I mean, you're trying to create a certain kind of character, a certain kind of person, and that's an outcome. People aren't a finished deal, really, ever, but you're headed on a road, and you do eventually arrive there. So, and that personality, that character, is what your whole progress has been about. But a far more familiar teleological line of thinking is that of the utilitarian. Classical utilitarianism begins with the works of Jeremy Bentham and James Mill and progresses on to John Stuart Mill, who I'm going to be talking about mostly today. And the utilitarian says this. It's just as easy and basic to understand as this. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness, because I know you're all sitting there going, well, what's happiness? What's happiness for me isn't necessarily happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, that is the opposite of happiness, the reverse of happiness, is intended to be pain and the privation of pleasure. There you go. You do something, and now let's be clear on this. We're not talking about your personal pleasure or pain. This is not an egoistic theory. This is simply saying that if we take a look at the world at large, if the thing I do creates more pain in the world than pleasure, or helps people lose pleasure that they'd have had otherwise, then you're doing something wrong. If, on the other hand, you do something that creates more happiness in total in the world, more pleasure in total in the world, alleviates some pain that people would otherwise have had, then you are behaving rightly. So we help the starving, we eliminate slavery, we promote equality and of the races and of the genders, and try to create as much pleasure in the world, happiness in the world. We do away with illness. We do everything we can fix and make better, providing it makes the most possible. I mean, it might be contended by some, well, you know, the upper classes of the 18th, 19th centuries, with either their ability to oppress the masses financially or own slaves, they were very, very, very happy. So we ask the question, all right, they were happy. They had a lot of pleasure. But did that pleasure balance off the misery they were causing for others? Now you'll say that's subjective. Only in the sense that all internal states of affairs are happening to a subject can you call it subjective. Now, Mill, as you'll read here, has some arguments on his own, but I want to take just a moment to talk about what Jeremy Bentham had to say. Bentham proposed what he called a hedonic calculus. That is, that you would consider an act moral or immoral after you'd done calculations regarding its outcome. Bentham says, let's take a look at every pleasure and every pain that we can see as the outcome of an action. And we'll look at it in terms of 7 variables. Intensity, how strong is the pleasure or pain? Duration, how long does the pleasure or pain last? The certainty or uncertainty of the pain or pleasure. Propinquity, how close is the pain or pleasure? Fecundity, will that pain or pleasure produce more pain or more pleasure? Purity, how completely pleasurable and or painful is the given action? And extent, how far will the pleasure or pain reach? And Bentham says if you calculate these and then subtract the one from the other, you will discover what the moral act is. It would be nice if we could do it in advance, but remember, we're judging outcomes. We're not judging up front and saying, well, we did the math and it worked out. The math worked out. I don't see what the problem is. No, we're judging the outcome. It's an after-the-fact judgment. I mean, we do the calculation in hopes that our calculation is right. And many of these calculations can be done more or less instantly. I was once out with some friends. We were going on a boat. We were at the boating ramp. There was a man with his small boy. They were trying to jack the boat up onto their ramp. The hitch on the trailer jumped the hitch on the car. It went rolling down into the bay, the launch area. Well, my friends and I jumped up and went right to work. We helped the fellow get the boat secured. We got the hitch back up onto the car. We got the son out of the way so he was safe while we restored everything. You'd say, well, when did you have time to do the math? Who needed to do the math? You knew, because after all, we've lived a whole life. We know what sorts of things are going to cause what kinds of pleasures and what kinds of pains. We jumped into action. Now, after the fact, you go back and do the math, and it turns out, yeah, we should have done it. But we didn't need to stop and do it. Again, the goal is always to internalize as much of the ethical theory as you possibly can, so that taking time to think isn't part of the issue. It's not supposed to be part of the issue for the utilitarian or for the Aristotelian or any of the people we're going to look at. You're supposed to make these matters habitual. You're supposed to have thought about them enough to understand them intuitively, that you have made them part of the fabric of who you are. So it's the criticism that, oh, who stopped and did the math? No, it means nothing at all. Now, after the fact, you can go back and evaluate things and determine whether or not your on-the-fly calculations were right. And sometimes you may turn out to be wrong. We're told, for example, that the part of what went into Truman's decision to drop the bomb on Japan, if it was Truman's decision, if he wasn't just carrying out already existing plans. But one of the things that was supposed to have been considered was that it was estimated that the loss of life involved would be less by dropping the bomb than it would be to carry out a full, all-out onslaught on invading the Japanese mainland. I don't know. We can't do both sets of numbers because you'd have to have actually done both to compare them completely. But the estimate is, at the time anyway, this was the way to go. After the fact, there's lots of ways of calculating it, and lots of people have done so. And they do so. They calculate it. They try to determine if this outcome was worth that action. We're not worried about principles of justice or principles of equality. We're worried about how many people did we hurt versus how many people did we save. And you can sit down and use Bentham's numbers and get exactly the answer that best describes the situation. Now, what Mill is concerned with largely here is answering the charge that, answering the charge that Bentham admitted to, that on his account, poetry is as good as pushpin. Pushpin being a form of tabletop bowling, I'm told. So, any pleasure is as good as any other pleasure once we've calculated it out. First of all, it's not clear to me that in the overall scheme of things, pushpin is ever going to add up to being better than poetry. But that's neither here nor there, according to Mill. According to Mill, that one element not really discussed, but he thought implicit in the writing of Bentham, was the propriety of a pleasure or pain to the individual. He simply is suggesting that if there is a pleasure that a human being could feel that a pig cannot, then that pleasure is more proper to a human being and therefore counts more as we do the math. He makes the point that that's often misquoted. It's quite often misquoted. He says, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, because the unique pleasures of the human animal, its intellectual capacities, its emotional capacities, even at their least exercise, is greater than any pig could ever have. I mean, I can't tell you for sure. We can go over to the psychology department. They can do some tests. But he at least suggests that pigs don't appreciate symphonies. Well, you say, I don't appreciate symphonies. I find the whole thing boring. Yeah, but you could, couldn't you? You could learn to like it maybe, or acquire at least a taste for some classical music. Pig can't. He says the pig satisfied is not comparable to a dissatisfied human. Better to be a Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. One of Mill's notions for education is that we improve our ability to enjoy the world in which we live. Used to work at a library at university in Florida. There was a fellow who brought his classes in for library instruction. And one night I talked to him before class about what I wanted to say, and I mentioned something to him and he liked it, and so I told it to the class. I said, look, the reason that Mr. Bones and I want you to learn how to use the library properly is so that you will be able to teach us new things. And it was like people were like, huh? We don't read these papers just for your grammar. We read these papers to learn something. We're all better when we're all better. Stole that one. But it's true. As everyone's well-being improves, then we all have the chance for greater pleasures in our life. And the more pleasure we have, the more happiness we have. The more happiness we have, the more moral our world is. When one person or a small group of people have all the pleasure and everybody else has all the pain, that's not moral. That's exactly the opposite of moral. Some people don't like the idea that we rate happiness in terms of pleasure. But Mill points out there are pleasures that are not merely physical. There are intellectual pleasures. There are things which most of us would talk about as being elevated. And he says that's right. And if you can learn to like those, then you will have more pleasure. You will find pleasures where you did not find pleasures before. And we can do that in both directions. I said a minute ago about learning to enjoy classical music. You could learn to enjoy more popular music, more styles, more kinds. And in doing so, find more pleasure in life in general. Be happier. Just a thought. But people who don't like pleasure misunderstand pleasure. Pleasure isn't simply voluptuousness. That there is pleasure in the kinds of sins of the body that most people think about when you talk about pleasure, but there's enormous pleasure in helping people, in accomplishing a good job, in making the world a happier place. Pleasure. And it's real pleasure, and it counts every bit as much as any kind of pleasure, and may in fact count more so because it is proper to a human being to do these kinds of things. Now, people have raised the question, apparently, in Mill's time. I have never heard anybody raise it today. This idea of, do you really have a right to pleasure or a right to happiness? This misses the point. Now, we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about Mill's views on justice somewhat later. But utilitarianism, in its purest sense, isn't interested in rights. All utilitarianism is interested in is creating happiness. So telling the utilitarian that you're not respecting rights, or you're making claims that you have no rights for, the utilitarian would answer, what are you talking about? I never mentioned rights in our whole conversation. Now, Mill, I think, gives a little more than he needs to here and suggests that since we have the capacity to feel pleasure, we have the right to feel pleasure. That's hard to argue with. But I just do think that it misses the point. We're not worried about rights. We're worried about happiness. And they are not the same thing. We invent legal rights to promote moral happiness. So when we talk about, say, from a utilitarian standpoint, the right to private property, all we're saying is that if we have private property and if it is respected in general, then we will have more cases of happiness in the world. But let's take one step back. You can't really invent rules. At least you can't invent absolute rules out of a utilitarian standpoint. An attempt was made called rule utilitarianism that said, well, whatever rule promotes the most happiness is the rule we should adopt. But the problem is there's going to be times when following the rule that most of the time brings about the most happiness will, in this instance, fail to bring about the most happiness. So there's no absolute rule that can be generated here. But any law is not an absolute rule. It's only a means of trying to realize a particular goal. And in trying to realize that goal, we may have to build in exceptions. And indeed, we do have exceptions to how far property rights go, exceptions to how far the freedom of speech go. All of these things, when they start creating more pain than pleasure, these are things where we say the law admits an exception here. One more statement in favor of utilitarianism. Again, the idea here is that which creates the most suffering is wrong. That which creates the most pleasure is right. And people have objected in the past. Well, religion seems to teach the opposite of that. At least Christianity does. And Jeremy Bentham said, what? What? There was never a more utilitarian action than Jesus dying on the cross. That one suffered so that everyone else will be able to be saved. I mean, that's in one sense utilitarianism at its purest. It also points the way to at least one important objection to it. But let's save that for the second half, okay? Keep talking philosophy.